right. Thank you and welcome. So glad you could join us today for the fourth in our series hosted by Ruotolo Associates on Contingency Planning 101, Realigning Resources for Robust Results. I'm Melpo Merdekis, the Vice President with Ruotolo Associates, and I'll be manning the deck and some of the logistics here today. So please feel free, we're going to keep this an interactive conversation. Please feel free to jump in if you've got a question, use the Q&A. And we'll I'll cycle through those as we have our conversation and see if we can address things as we go along. And if we have time when we complete, we'll see if we can leave a little bit of space there for Q&A as well. I am so pleased to be able to welcome Angela Gunderson, Director of Operations and Senior Consultant with Meitler, who's going to be joining me today. So Angela, I would love it if you would just give us a little bit of an introduction yourself and Meitler, and we can get started.
Sure. Thank you, Melpo, for inviting me to join you today on this call. It's an exciting topic and one that is definitely coming up quite a bit in conversations that we are as a company at Meitler. So first about Meitler itself. Meitler was founded in 1971 by Neil Meitler, who saw the need in the church for professional planning. He recognized that schools with a strategic vision for the future could proactively change and be ready, where schools who failed to change would struggle or close. So as you can see, Meitler is one of the few planning firms that is full-time staff of professional consultants who worked in the area that we work with now. All four of us consultants who are full-time come from the background as teachers, directors of curriculum and instruction, principals of elementary and high school, Catholic schools, as well as superintendents in different dioceses. And the same works for our parish planning side as well. So any of our consultants who work with parishes and dioceses in the parish sector also have extensive backgrounds in that area as well. So a couple areas that we kind of pride ourselves on at Meitler. Everything that we do is backed by solid research. We do a lot of demographic research, data, financial analysis. So while every project is different, there are certain pieces that are incorporated into every study and plan that we work with every client. Additionally, we have our support team also, who works very closely with the consultants to make sure that everything moves from beginning to end throughout the process as seamless as possible. And the number one thing is just making sure that our clients know that it is their plan or their study, and that we are just kind of help do a lot of the research and help with the writing piece of it, but that it's something that they take ownership of.
Terrific. Anything about your own personal background, Angela, you want to share just to connect with our viewers?
Absolutely. So I just officially finished my first full year here at Meitler at the beginning of August. Prior to Meitler, I started out as a 3rd through 8th grade teacher, was director of curriculum and instruction, and then most recently served as principal of a K-3 through 8th grade Catholic elementary school in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. And now have, like I said, been with Meitler for a full year, do a lot of the data, the demographic research. I'm big with love numbers, things like that. That's every study that I look forward to.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, so glad to have you with us on this particular planning webinar. So a little bit about Ruotolo Associates and the connection with Meitler. You know, for those of you who've been on the webinars previously, you know that one of the things we mentioned is that we're part of the Collegium family. And so is Meitler. So this is really an opportunity for us to demonstrate to you the generative partnership that comes out of the Collegium family, that we really all serve to promote and advance mission within the nonprofit arena. But we do it by bringing very different skill sets and ones that are quite complementary. And so this is just a way to sort of showcase how our work dovetails and coordinates in serving our clients. And Meitler and Ruotolo Associates have worked together often, kind of seamlessly transitioning from Meitler planning to our advancement work. As you know, we do comprehensive advancement counsel and provide that to nonprofits across the country, not only serving faith-based institutions similar to Meitler in schools, churches, archdioceses, dioceses, metropolises, but also other educational institutions, colleges and universities, community service, cultural institutions as well. And we've got 15 consultants that are across the country. I myself am here in Minneapolis. So, and have had an association with the firm dating back to 1991. So on and off with a personal practice as well. So it's been a great history. Meitler started in 1971, Ruotolo Associates in 1979. So there's just a rich history for both firms. So let's dive into our content today because we've got a lot to cover. So this again is our fourth in response to our survey, What's Keeping You Up at Night? So we knew re-envisioning events and annual fund were our top two, as well as kind of addressing the all of the above stress that hit. But contingency planning, it's interesting, looking up contingency is really a future event or circumstance that cannot be predicted with certainty. And if that doesn't describe our time right now, I don't know what is. So it is not surprising at all that this is weighing heavily on advancement professionals and nonprofit leaders. So this notion of how do we take any sense of planning and apply it in this uncertain landscape. So I want to address one thing. I had attended a program at Tufts in January, and we went through a concept called the theory of change. If you do this, then you can expect this as the step, then this is an outcome, and very predictability of if you do X, Y will occur, and you can ultimately play that out to Z. Great for planning. Dr. Al-Noor presented to us in his book, Measuring Social Change, Performance and Accountability in a Complex World. And I think, boy, how much more complex our world has gotten since January. So when we were talking about this, Angela and I were chatting about this just the other day, kind of putting our deck together, and we really talked about this sense of hearing from clients, what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if the other? And it creates this abundance of uncertainty and this ambiguity of going forth. So really, as we talk about planning going forward through our hour today, we're going to talk about kind of changing that if planning that we know with some certainty we could have predicted before to what if planning. And how do we build out some flexibility and adaptability in our planning so that we really can pivot and shift as our climate and our environment changes. So what we're going to cover today, 3 highlights. Those of you may be familiar. We're first going to acknowledge and validate the compounding influences. We have certainly never seen the kind of compounding stressors that we have in our world today, and without the sense that we see an end. So this really, now we're shifting from sprint to marathon. And so we always want to be mindful of what's the context we're operating in. Second, we're going to identify some planning fundamentals. And this, Angela, is where I'm really going to be excited for you as we move into the next slides to talk about some of the fundamental tools that you use at Meitler in planning. And then we're going to shift to exploring contingency challenges and opportunities and how we apply those best practices to create really adaptable and agile contingency plans. So let's start first with the compounding factors. COVID-19 began. March was when March 13th, we're kind of at the anniversary for some of us of that marker of shelter in place, of really changing our world operationally. But from that initial COVID-19 impact, we've now had ripples that affect us economically, both globally in terms of the constituencies and markets that we serve, but also internally with our own staffs, our own organizations, we've seen that impact. And so we really need to be mindful of the stress that has on ourselves, on our team, on our constituents. Likewise, the issues of equity and justice that have been rippling again throughout our communities. And for many of us, Angela, we talked about this as well, that for some of our clients, this is a very real and very internal issue that perhaps may have been something that they were addressing on the periphery, but has really come to the forefront. Likewise, we know that many of you have talked about just the challenges of staying relevant in this world, especially if your mission is not so much social service or first responder or healthcare, kind of in that immediacy of COVID response. But how do you keep your mission relative to kind of the nuance of what's echoing in our world? And finally, the very clear mechanics of operating remotely, the mechanics and logistics of it, and the social, emotional, and psychological effects that impact our team and impact our constituents. Angela, I'm curious from your team, what has been one of the fundamental shifts that you've experienced just in having to go remote? Because you and I both were road warriors before
Right.
this.
Yeah, it took a lot, I think, to switch into this new normalcy. But it ended up being a positive change. It was something that was kind of talked about prior that, do we need to be on the road as much? Do we need this space? And there were a lot of mixed emotions on that. A lot of my colleagues at Meitler have, been working in an office and kind of been in that routine for many years. And there was a comfort there. But like you said, it's also the social piece of it. We don't have that connection, that camaraderie now every day, when we all go together and share about ourselves with one another. So we do that as best as we can, through our Zoom calls and things like that. There's been both sides of it. There's been pros and cons to it. It's been nice too, because we have learned that our world and our job can move forward, whether we're in an office or not. So we've definitely learned to be more cognizant of that, and that has forced us to change some of the things that we do as a company for the better.
I think that's well said, because I think there are things that we are not aware of that we need to be a little more intentional about. As you said, kind of touching base with our team. And I know we've set up regular Zoom calls as a part of this. That's become part of our planning, is how are we connecting? And I think that needs to be something that's on the plan going forward. There isn't that very organic sense of touching base. We need to do so with intention. So with that, I'm going to talk about, kind of our current plans, Angela, and we talked about, what do you do? What do you do with the plan that you may have right now?
I would say the first question is asking yourself if you have a plan, making sure that you have something in place. You want to be able to start somewhere. So if you do have an existing plan, it's looking at kind of what is the relevance behind it right now? What in that plan needs to continue to move forward? What are some of those things that need to change? And ultimately, what are those things that maybe aren't as relevant right now that we maybe need to pull back on a little bit and even push to the side sometimes to say, yes, this is something that we want to eventually continue to move forward on, but now is not the time for that. So it's really looking at what are the needs of your organization right now and really putting those into that relevance order, because as you can kind of see here, then those are your most high impact results. You want to get the best out of that plan as you possibly can. And so making sure that it coincides with your organization's needs right now would be first and foremost.
And it's a great point, because that sense of establishing priority based on relevance is really something that we're seeing right now. But again, it's always valuable to go and make sure that if you do have an established plan, what's there? Don't just bypass it to say, well, that's not applicable. A lot of work oftentimes has gone into that, and you want to make sure that you are looking at the historical context and what's been established to date, and then pull and cull and discern what's priority right now and what's relevant. Yes, you absolutely may need to adapt and build on top of that, but you want to make sure that your foundational elements that may exist, you're really building upon. So excellent. So let's talk about the Meitler way. Tell us a little bit about that, Angela.
Absolutely. So this is really the groundwork of every project that we do at Meitler. As you can see, the 4 steps are right there. We engage, we analyze, we mobilize, and we implement. So now what does that mean? That first step of any project is to hit the ground running. We meet with as many people as we possibly can. We want to hear from all stakeholders, all constituents within an organization, and really just listen. Step 1 is to listen, kind of gather that information, gathering some data, understanding a wide spectrum of different perspectives. And that really helps us to help that client be more innovative and really achieve a transformational plan. The second step of analyzing, again, once we've kind of gathered all of that data, step 2 is to analyze a lot of that, looking through the lens of experience, looking again at how to make this plan innovative. The team then takes all of that data, forms a unique and objective transformation plan. But with that, we're doing that with our clients. So it's kind of, as I said before, this isn't our plan, it's your plan. And so we work, hand in hand with kind of compiling that data. Step 3 then being to mobilize that plan that we've created with you. We then share that out to your community. And It's really that, it's that ownership of it. We need to make sure that leadership and anyone involved in the implementation piece of this plan understands what it is and takes ownership of it, and all are on the same page to say, yes, this is what we need and this is how we're going to achieve it. Fourth step then of implementation, again, we are there side by side to help you through the implementation process. Again, it's your plan. I will continue to say that, but we are there to help answer any questions. We will share the plan with others in the community if that's helpful. So those are really the 4 main steps in every project that we do here at Meitler.
So great, Angela. And as we talked about, this is kind of the fundamental best practice of planning, and really focusing on, again, that data-driven plan that's owned by the client that can really move them forward and advance mission. Now we're in this uncertain reality. So let's talk about how that adapts, not just for clients working with you, but how those steps can be kind of taken, even in pieces, by institutions that may not be able to capitalize with Meitler's expertise, but take some of those best practice tools and apply them in their own organization.
Sure. So right now, just in the work that we're hearing, and again, like Milpo said, this goes across all organizations, it's this message of we can't plan for everything. And while we understand and respect that, our response to that though too is that we need to plan for as much as we possibly can. One of the main ways that we have seen this, especially in this response planning, is in these different reopening plans that schools, are putting out. Mm-hmm. There is a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C. And most importantly, it's sharing all of these plans with your community so that they can really see we are ready for anything. All parents, all students, teachers, they want to know, what have you planned for, and those what ifs. Again, as Mel said at the beginning, we're kind of changing the if to what if. And it's really on us as organizations to say that we have to be ready for anything, and that we can shift and be fluid in our planning depending on how things change. Better to have plans in place than be surprised with some of these what if moments that hit us. And then we kind of struggle to put something together quickly, whereas we have multiple plans in place ahead of time. We can really work collaboratively within our organization, receive that feedback from everyone, and again, develop a plan that everyone kind of has ownership of and believes in.
It's great, Angela. It touches on that point that we're really addressing right now, moving from where we were in March to where we are now in August, heading into the fall, is we're going from that reactive mode to being intentional and responsive, and really being able to be thoughtful and have kind of our backup plan and the backup to the backup plan. Exactly. But one of the things that I heard recently, and I really valued this term, was that planning can help us reduce ambiguity. And when we think about the impact of ambiguity, just in terms of stress, that unknown, there are so many things that are uncertain. And yes, we may put a plan in place and it may need to change within a week or two. But just having that thoughtful intention of plan A, and then the sense that, okay, we know we've already kind of arranged and thought out the contingency for plan B, really does demonstrate that forward thinking, that intentional thought that helps give some comfort, for lack of, to our constituents, to our team, to say, all right, we've got a path. We may need to, again, be agile and adapt as we go, but we've got a little bit of a roadmap from where we are. And that, I think, is something that we can't underestimate in terms of engaging our team and engaging our constituents so that they have a sense of what our roadmap is and where we're going.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk. One of the areas that you focus on, Angela, with Meitler, is enrollment management, which we know for schools, and this is really adaptive to other institutions that are looking at increasing membership or retaining membership. The principles can apply. So let's walk through this a little bit, just as one example.
Sure. The two main questions kind of that we're starting with are, how are you maintaining your current constituent base? Again, that retention piece, sometimes we take for granted those that are already within our organization, and sometimes those groups of people fall short a little bit when we continue to market and outreach to new groups. So not only how are you maintaining the current constituent base, but how are you expanding your market? Obviously, when we work with schools, an enrollment management program is something that we recommend, all schools put into place. First off, you're establishing your clarity of mission. everything and all that we do, reverts back to our mission as a company, as a community, whatever that case may be. Creating an enrollment management team, making sure, again, that this is a collaborative piece that multiple people within your organization are working on together. And then the plan itself, the enrollment management plan should include really those general audiences. Who could you reach out to and market to? But also you need to be very specific. You need to know your community. You need to know your market base. Who are those groups that you can try to bring, into your organization that you maybe never even thought of? And that's where that database comes into play. So really tracking, who are you reaching out to? How are you marketing to them? And is it working or is it not? Because we can continue to do the same marketing over and over again, but if we're not tracking that data and really finding where people are coming from and how they're finding us, we really can't improve on that for the future. Additionally, looking at kind of your multi-year and annual goals. We've talked about that a little bit already, and we'll get into that further as we go through this presentation, but what are your short-term and what are your long-term goals? Making sure that those are attainable, that they're realistic, again, and that you have team members that are able to achieve those with you. A marketing plan is another piece of that. Again, what is your brand? How are you putting that out there to others? Making sure that people know who you are. Recruiting strategies, again, kind of goes along with our retention. How are we keeping the current people? How are we finding new? And really for schools, one key piece of that also is having appropriate data that's related to tuition assistance. Financials right now, as Meitler mentioned with the economy, we really need to rethink some of these tuition assistance strategies that we've been using in the past and reevaluate them for the future. And there's some very specific questions that can kind of go along with making sure that we have relevant and appropriate data to back it up.
Excellent. So thinking about how these adapt to maybe fundraising strategy for an institution that's not in the enrollment or the school environment, this notion of retention is something that we've touched on, because right now donor retention, it has remained flat under 50%. And when we think about that, it's those people who have chosen us already, but we're not necessarily investing what we need to. And is that retention in our plan going forward? Oftentimes we know it's always about expanding the market and getting new donors and attracting getting sort of new market share in new areas. We know that costs more than it does to retain. And so this may be, when we think about contingency planning, part of it is reinforcing infrastructure and core pieces that we can focus on. And that donor retention piece is really critical in that. When donors were asked, first-time donors, and then why they gave initially and why they gave as a follow-up, even within this COVID window. Initially, if a new donor came in, their top three, it was COVID, need, and community first. When you asked for the gift and ongoing continued giving, it inverted a little bit to need, community, then COVID. So what happened is COVID really kind of prompted that initial response to something, and people will react quickly. Then as you start to plan out how you're telling your story and demonstrating your impact from a need base, what you address, what your mission is, and what that impact is, they become a part of that community and understand it. Then COVID becomes that more tangential piece that's part of the environment, but it's not the driver. And so as you're thinking about planning and retention, really think about how you are setting the stage for not only engaging donors initially, but maintaining and retaining. And that's kind of stewarding those relationships. That really needs to be an ongoing part of your planning. So let's talk, you mentioned, Angela, refining the timeline. And I think this is something that really is critical as we talk about contingency planning. We mentioned, do you have a plan? Do you have many plans are 3 to 5 years. And so you might have those established goals in a 5-year plan. One, if you have it, pull it off the shelf if it's not. Hopefully it's a plan that's very organic, very alive and fluid within your institution, so you can tap and get active on it right away. If not, think about how that can happen. Because the last thing we want is for all of the work to go into planning, whether it is long-term or contingency, and then not have it be really utilized in day-to-day operations. So thinking about the foundation and sort of the set of your established plan, what are the adaptable components? You know, for a number of institutions that we've worked with, and I will say this is true, we'll talk about engagement, but things like live streaming and virtual learning, those were things that were kind of part of the plan, but not really priority before. Well, they certainly got moved again from the back to the front burner. And on for your institution, there may be other things that you just thought that'd be nice to have, but now are really essential. And so you've got to look at, you may have the plan in place for how to implement it, but now it's a matter of moving it to the forefront from a timing standpoint. Yes, there may be some pieces that need to be adapted within that, but again, don't lose sight of what work has been done and see how you can build on it and refine it. It's also a way of validating and valuing the work that's been done to date, because generally those plans, you know, Angela talked about all of the stakeholder engagement. And so we want to make sure that it's not a quick shift from where we were. You know, we've talked about, if anybody knows that old adage of a ship navigation, if you move just 1 or 2 degrees off your mark, you end up in a very different location. And so oftentimes we can find that if we're sort of reacting to a quick COVID response or something else response, an immediate need, we want to make sure it's not taking our whole plan completely off track. We may need to do a little bit of a rejigger, but that is going back to rooting it in the established plan. Annual goals, it's interesting. There we want to talk about kind of refining objectives. And it may be that initially we were looking at that gain of new donors or that increase in dollars, where now it may be, let's make sure that we're holding on and that we're really securing retention. We've been doing a number of surveys through the course of this COVID time period, Angela, and it's been interesting. One of the things we've asked is how COVID-19 has affected your philanthropy. And for many, it's reinforced their priorities, and they've really focused on, they want to continue those commitments. So we want to make sure that we're reinforcing that. But in other cases, there may be goals that we really need to reallocate resources. We've talked in a previous webinar about events, and that there's a lot of dollars that go into the infrastructure planning of events. And while some of that may shift to the reinforcement that you need, platforms and things, there may be other dollars that can now shift to goals that are imminent and things that may not have been in the budget. When we talk about contingency planning, that's really, okay, what's at the forefront? What are those new things that really are what we've got to address right now? For schools, I know for a lot of them, and Angela, you can speak to this, is what are they needing in terms of tools, resources, and training to adapt in this? And how is that being reflected in their plans? So what are you seeing?
The biggest thing, kind of like you said, is that it's changing constantly. You know, and that we're meeting or working with a principal, they kind of have that plan in place, and then it's, you know, things have shifted and now we need to go back to it again. However, they're finding though that that's easier to do just because they had that initial plan to start.
Exactly.
Starting from scratch. They had a plan, things are shifting, now they only have pieces of it that they need to continue to work with. And some of those back to front burner issues, as you mentioned, this virtual, you know, online learning, teachers were thrown into that, you know, March, and schools just had to figure it out. And, you know, ultimately they did a wonderful job, you know, of adapting and change and figuring things out on the fly. But now there's an expectation for that, right? And so if they go back to this virtual learning, this online learning, parents and schools and communities are going to expect more, because now you've had the time to plan. And so what does your plan look like moving forward? What kind of professional development and training have you given, you know, to your teachers and staff, and also to the students themselves? This is a new world for them too. So if we're able to, even for students who are coming back to school, again, there's so much training and different protocols that are put into place that we didn't plan for, you know, prior to the 2020-2021 school year. So, it's really just making sure that you have those objectives, what you need to accomplish, and kind of what are those action steps that go along with making sure that they do.
Absolutely. So it's interesting. I'm going to pivot back and forth between these two, because we touched a lot on these digital engagement strategies as we talk about it. You know, you mentioned with online learning, it's that training and tools. And I want to speak to this for some of those institutions that may be dealing with access issues here. whether it's a school, whether it's staff working remotely, or tapping into being able to reach your constituents. Do they have access to the technology to be able to connect with you in the way that we do? You know, these are new channels for many institutions, or they're channels that are being amplified, where we may have had other ways that we engaged through, you know, events, real-time meetings, email, other ways that we were connecting, that now we're really needing to lean into digital engagement. And what does that look like? You know, for live streaming, many of our parish clients are looking at, okay, what do we need to do to get the equipment to really have this reinforced? I can say one in particular, you know, this had been a back burner issue for them to live stream services. And their concern was, if we live stream events, activities, even for other kinds of clients' classes, is that going to limit the kind of real-time engagement or in-person engagement that we have? And so for many, that was kind of why, one of the rationales behind keeping this on the back burner. Well, now that this becomes our sole lifeline for connecting as a community, it's really imperative. But the key here, and this comes down to realigning resources. You may not have in your budget the notion of getting the kind of equipment that your institution needs and increasing the access for your constituents, but it is a high priority item right now, and you're going to have to look at your budget in terms of how can you allocate not only the dollars necessary maybe for the capital equipment or expenses, but also for the training and onboarding for your staff to know how to utilize it, for your constituents to understand, you know, things like online giving. For a number of institutions, that's been one of those adaptive shifts. Well, in your planning, how are you messaging? How are you providing some training for some of those constituents, even staff members and volunteers, board leaders who don't necessarily understand the specifics of it, but this is now your lifeline. It's your one way in to reach. So when we're thinking about these kinds of digital engagement strategies relative to planning, it's what do you need to map out for immediate need, you know, short term, and how's that going to affect annual giving and next phase growth. So one of our clients is looking at their regional network of institutions, and so they've been doing some spot things with sharing classes that one institution may have, and they're looking at creating kind of this virtual network and this content database to share this, because they can't interact live and in person. So one of the things that they did, and this is a really important point that I want to note for our listeners, is they had a relationship with a foundation, and they reached out, and the foundation, in response to COVID, had shifted and adjusted their guidelines. And they were really looking for responsive and adaptive strategies to look at things just like this that may not have been in your foresight or in your immediate planning previous to COVID, but is now. And so they were able to put a foundation grant together and look at kind of the short-term immediate need, and then mapped it out for year 2 and year 3. And this is something that we're really seeing. Community foundations are particularly being pivotal right now in looking at operational needs and things that maybe they didn't address as much. You know, they may have been a little more restrictive. Other foundations likewise. So as you are looking at reallocating resources and where you may have an increased need, really in your budgeting, begin to think about those foundation relationships that you have, and reach out and make sure that you're finding out where they are in the cycle and if they're expanding, because those are things you want to make sure that you're investing in. Likewise for virtual events, you know, when we spoke about that on a couple of our previous webinars, we really talked about making sure that you weren't just saying, hey, this is going to be all free. We got a Zoom deck, we've got our staff, it's just going to roll. You're going to need to make some investments, and those are going to need to be planned for. And so, again, there's a real ripple between all of the topics that are causing some stress, and they do kind of land in this planning piece, because you do need to lay it out and map out what's going to be essential for you to do the kind of adaptive programming in response to the restrictions that we're facing, and what are the implications in terms of budget and resource. And we'll kind of talk about that a little further. But I think digital engagement is one of those things that, you know, again, we talked about it at the beginning, Angela, we need to do it with our teams. And so for those of you on the call, you're thinking about your constituents first. If we know anything about nonprofit leaders, it is you are thinking of the other first. But we always want to reinforce, make sure you're thinking about yourself and your team as well, because you need to be fully equipped and ready to be able to do your job to serve your constituents. So that may need to be built into the budget and planning as well.
And I would just add too, Melpo, you know, when I look at these three areas, it's also just kind of that continuous reflection on them also. You know, some of these we were forced into, like you said, that maybe we're on the back burner. But now as we move forward, what worked? Are some of these things then that we're saying, okay, this went really well and we're going to continue to do this? You know, some of which, for example, that I have learned about, you know, the virtual events that obviously used to be face-to-face, moved to this online platform. Now there's, you know, hybrids that are coming up for, you know, hopefully the coming year when we can go back face-to-face. But it was, well, okay, we can have these people face-to-face. We can also offer this opportunity to those who can't be here. And some of these things will continue to shift and push us to look at that constant change factor. Again, what are the things that we're going to keep doing that are working well? What are some that we said, okay, we had to do this, we tried it, it didn't work out so well. But just that constant reflective piece of making sure that we're always pushing for more, for better success in what we're doing.
Great point, Angela, and it really enforces your notion of tracking. And unless you track what you're doing, you're not going to be able to measure that impact. And when you measure the impact, you're able then to look at your lessons learned and say, hey, this was worth the investment. And it's really critical, especially when you need to manage up with your leaders, because there may be some who say, this may require a big investment up front, and there's going to be a question about, boy, what's the return on that investment going to be? Unless you can measure and track that change, it's going to be really difficult to validate that just based on, well, this is what we think will work. And I know for many institutions, many of our clients it's taking that pause in this moment before we move into, you know, Q4 to say what has worked, what are the lessons learned. And so thank you, Angela. I really think that reflective piece is a really important point. So let's talk a little bit now about planning by the numbers, because I was just on a call this morning with a client planning out, you know, a strategic planning process and kind of an adaptive contingency plan piece. And one of the first things was planning for numbers, because their numbers have shifted. And so we know for schools that number has shifted maybe down a little bit, in not necessarily for every Catholic school. As you and I talked about the other day, there are a number that are really able to leverage this to their advantage. But likewise, for those of you on the call, there may be some social service agencies, human service, direct aid, where you're seeing an increased need to serve. And so you've got to look at how you scale your plan to reach that. And that goes back to, again, what are those fundamentals and best practice that exist in your plan that you can build upon to scale up? Because again, it's not just a matter of kind of multiplying things out, but you've got to make sure that you've got it reinforced to build. What are some of your kind of key best practices that you think of when you look at right sizing a plan, Angela?
I think for me, it all still goes back to kind of the data, the demographics, really knowing your community, your organization. If you don't have that data in front of you, it really makes it hard to kind of shift some of these things. We have worked with schools in the past where, you know, their goal is to increase enrollment, you know, 30% over 30 years. And when you look at kind of the demographics and the research behind it, it doesn't show necessarily that that's a realistic goal. So it's really being able to analyze the data demographics to be able to find that right size for your organization, and really be able to back that up, because you're going to end up kind of doing yourself more hurt if you're continually trying to grow, if that's not what the research shows or what the demographics show. You're going to kind of put yourself in a position of really struggling to kind of meet those extremes, you know, for here when reality is maybe a little bit lower. And it's not to say that you can't continue to grow and improve, but by finding that right size, you can offer more, you can be the best at it because you have found that right size for your organization, instead of always constantly striving for something different.
Yeah, it's a great point, Angela. And, you know, it's interesting, that regional institution, that client I was talking about, one of the things they're talking and speaking of right now is that sense of property and engagement. Do they need as many physical sites as they have had? And is there a sense that you can reduce the size but increase the vibrancy and engagement, increase the impact that each one makes? And that's something that's very different than our mindset. Our mindset is always more is better and add to it. And I think this is giving us that pause, and it's really allowing us the opportunity to say, you know what? It's okay to say maybe now's the time to look at a different model, but a different model might be exactly what we can plan for really effectively. So you mentioned the data. So let's go into the data-driven planning and what's essential there. As we definitely share the value here.
Right. This is one piece that I said kind of from the beginning that we at Meitler really pride ourselves on. When it comes to the demographics, when we're meeting and we're on a project, we're actually scheduling meetings with city, county planners. We're not just going and looking at, census information, things like that, but we have multiple softwares that we use. And like I said, we prefer to hear the story firsthand, live it and work it every day. Seems to be the most valid, both qualitative and quantitative. Again, we're pulling data from the school, the archdiocese, anywhere that we can, even sometimes public schools, to kind of look at the comparative picture when working in schools. But also, like I said, we're meeting with all constituents, all stakeholders. Everyone has a voice in this through focus groups, and those that we can't speak to face-to-face, we're sending surveys out as well. So surveys are a big piece too of making sure, again, that we're really triangulating the data is what it comes down to. You're going to have those anomaly pieces, maybe some data pieces that were a little skewed for a few years. There's stories behind that. And that's kind of the big piece of Meitler too, is that the data helps us tell the story or ask the right questions. It doesn't give us all of the answers. And so we believe and have always believed that data and facts are necessary to make wise decisions. We don't guess at anything. Our plans, our reports that we give back to clients, we always tell them that there should be nothing that was overly surprising to them. It should be pretty consistent with what they already know. But again, it's where do we go from here? It's custom crafted, innovative plan, successful implementation. And that's really the key to the process of making sure that these are successful.
Excellent. So it's interesting. You talk about the stakeholder engagement, and I think this is one of the things that's probably the most accessible element for many of those who are on the call with us today, many of our client constituents that may be doing some of this planning on their own. This is, we have talked throughout this era about staying connected. It began with taking the temperature of your constituents, kind of checking in to see how everybody is, to continuing those really important dialogues that are all about stewarding relationship with our internal and external constituencies. And surveys, invitation to engage in a survey for planning is such a valuable way for stakeholders to contribute. And it's not only for them to contribute, but it's also for them to be focusing forward and thinking ahead. And in this time, that has such great impact because it allows them to step out of sort of the uncertainty and the ambiguity of the day and begin to say, okay, there is going to be a next day and a next quarter and a next year. And with what we know, here's what we see. And so, we've talked about ways to engage in this digital era. And I know, Angela, you mentioned both of us have seen upticks and increases in participation in surveys through this era. People are more accessible. If for nothing else, not being on the road and traveling where we're, in a plane or in a car where we're inaccessible, but really we're finding people, and we're finding that there's an increased interest in being able to contribute to the conversation, especially when they see that this is about how to move an institution forward. So everything from the Zoom interview to facilitating virtual focus groups. And I know that for some can be a little challenging. You may not have the expertise, but somebody within your community may. This is a great way to tap into your volunteer base, your leadership base, or to outsource it. Both Meitler and Ruotolo associates do this, but we want to make sure that you've got some skills you're walking away with today that you can apply directly yourself. And so this is all about that conversation to say, hey, here's where we're going, give them a little bit of an update, but get their sense about what they see and what, from their perspective, their lens, they see as the future of your institution. One of the questions we ask Angela is always, what are the most pressing issues? Top 3 issues facing the institution. That tells us more than probably 10 other questions about, strengths, weaknesses, and things, because it really is kind of an internal, external gauge because those issues really address what's happening in the marketplace that we need to address, and how does that reflect on what we have in order to be able to kind of address it and address it fully. Relative to surveys, if you're going to do something going out, from the very beginning, we've addressed this notion of kind of the cacophony of information that's been going out, and people that have been kind of inundated with e-surveys and things, just like we sent out to all of you to respond. Find ways to make it engaging, succinct. You want to get some good content, but you don't want to overwhelm. And you also want to make sure that you're kind of coordinating with other entities within your institution. We know that they may be tapping into surveys for other things, but if you're looking at it from a planning perspective, make sure that you're orchestrating that holistically within your organization so that you can ensure that people aren't going, well, wait a minute, what does this have to do with the survey that I got over here from the alumni group, and what does this have to do over here? So be sure that you're doing that, but this is such a critical way to gain information, not only to get direction, but to get buy-in from your constituents to make sure they feel a part of this process. Angela, what else have you learned through this time about engaging stakeholders in this really important qualitative piece?
Sure. I would just say too, I just wanted to piggyback off of what you just ended with, kind of those surveys. You know, the biggest thing too is just don't send out a blind survey. You know, make sure that there's communication going out prior to that, really explaining the purpose of what you're doing, who you are, just so that there's clear understanding that when that survey does come, people see it and say, oh yes, I expected this. And then they're more apt to fill it out also. I found that obviously just sending them out with not much background knowledge information that way tends to get a little tricky. But other things too, just in regards to kind of this invitation to engage, we have found too, it's kind of helpful if we kind of keep a recurring, you know, schedule with certain groups too. We have a group of 11 principals that we meet with, and we now know it's every 2 weeks. You know, no matter what, we're meeting every 2 weeks. We're talking through successes, challenges. It has been virtual, you know, since March. We were even doing it virtually prior to that, just given, you know, locations. But having that recurring schedule has really helped too, because it's already just kind of blocked out. Trying to constantly schedule new tends to get a little more difficult, because there's kind of some burnout with so many of these Zoom calls and people feeling like they're on their computers all day, that if you have something that's just kind of blocked out, set for that group, there seems to be more consistency of participation in that regard.
Yeah, to that point of timing, it's interesting as well. So if you're thinking about engaging constituents, donors maybe, in a survey for planning, one of the things to think about is to capture them and use this as an opportunity to dialogue with them in an off-cycle time. So if you perhaps engage them in the spring for cultivation and donation, maybe it is in early fall a great chance to talk with them about planning. It really becomes a very thoughtful and purposeful way to cultivate the relationship and steward it in between asks and in between other areas of engagement. So when we talk about aligning the direction, some of the things that you'll find, whether it's through a formal study that you might engage Meitler or Ruotolo to do, where we're talking with your constituents and stakeholders, or whether it's something you're looking at, things to be open for as you're looking at planning is, you know, affirm what you know. We've talked a lot about assumptions and presumptions, and this notion about, you know, affirming what you know. Make sure that's really accurate and you're not living off of old data or old information and perception. And that means being open in this other corner to correct what you thought you knew. You know, that openness when you go into survey for planning is really critical, to not be looking at it with kind of the lens of the past to say, well, of course this is going to be that way. You really need to be open. And that's likewise discerning what you don't know and being open to new issues. We really can't stress that enough, that this is, if there has been a real silver lining in this COVID crisis and this shift in planning, it has been, we've really kind of broken down and gotten rid of a lot of the rules or the we have always dones in institutions, because certain things can't be done that way. And so the kind of innovation and the kind of new thinking that for many of you as leaders in your organization may have been really striving to push, you now have a blank slate to do that on, or a little bit more of an open window through which to present that. But doing some survey work really and data work may be able to reinforce that shift. So just important to be thinking about when you're aligning your direction to have that openness when you're in that dialogue. Likewise, and I just want to look at our time to make sure we get through all of our slides here, we really have been talking all through here about assessing resources. And for some of you, we know where volunteers have been critical on site, that's been something you've missed because, museums, cultural institutions, for many of you, you've been closed. And so a lot of the roles that have been traditional have been sidelined. And so as we look at things relative to planning, survey engagement, and other things, how can you tap into some of those volunteer resources to be able to engage them in a different way to help advance your mission? Likewise, leadership. This is still so critical. I know going back to the survey responses, we had, a few people who said, I still have board members who are thinking everything's going to go back to the way it was. And so if anything you can take away here, and we've talked about it in previous sessions, is you've got enough of a track record, and if you track and measure, to say it is going to change. And while it's not leaving mission, we always, both Angela and I have reinforced, Meitler and Ruotolo reinforced, you got to stay true to mission, but you've got to make sure that you are adapting to the changing climate and ensuring that you are advancing that mission in new ways. And that's going to mean some changes. And so looking at ways that you, again, adapt program. Maybe you've got funds that get reallocated, as we say, from events to other things, or from other programs that maybe were priority before to things that have really amped up and increased their front burner need. You're going to have to do that. So, but look at all of your resources and look at the ways that they may be able to be shifted in the short term from long-term plans. Angela, anything on this particularly? Because then I know we're gonna talk a little bit about the hybrid piece, and I think that's
critical. I just want to say that now is the time. Now is the time for planning. Now is the time for change. And kind of looking at that leadership piece also, when you have the data and you have that sort of raw information that you can present to your leadership, our suggestion is always to kind of let them soak that in for a minute. Mm-hmm. Ask them, based on this data that you see, where do we need to go from here? What needs to change? Mm-hmm. I think allowing the leadership group to be able to say, based on this data, we believe this is where we need to go, kind of puts you in a better spot than to say, exactly. So we at Meitler and Ruotolo, when we give our recommendations, those don't always have to come out, first and foremost to leadership. Let them sit with that data for a little bit and kind of let them see firsthand that things do need to change. And then we can help kind of offer some of those recommendations of how.
Excellent, excellent. So thinking about hybrid planning, I think this is something that's just, the image that comes to my mind is kind of the aperture lens of a camera. And that right now we've got it very narrowly focused for many of us on Q4. And what do we need to do to achieve our objectives in Q4? But that's going to gradually expand as we go into looking at, okay, year 2021. And there's going to be some perpetual change that's going to be a result of this. And as we've talked about, in many cases, it's great innovation and great opportunity that we would not have necessarily tapped into had we not been challenged as a result of this crisis. And so this is where it's so important to make sure that we are open to what those changes are, that we're presenting the positive impact and kind of return on that change to our leadership and to our constituents, and talking about how that aligns in mission. But the reality is our planning is going to continue to be more of this hybrid, short, intermediate, and long term. And so knowing how to connect the dots between those is going to be a really instrumental skill going forward. What are your thoughts, Angela?
I agree with that 100%, and it goes back to a lot of the points that we've made kind of throughout. You need to look at the here and now. There's so much going on. What does your organization need now? And some of those Q4 are going to transition, right into year 2020. Again, that's that reflective piece of keeping what's working, keep moving ahead on that, and continue to improve on the things that aren't.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, finally, we want to leave you kind of, we're big on the rule of three and three key points. And the theme of this is really to be bold, because this is an opportunity. I know it can feel overwhelming. And there's a sense of one more thing that you have to do and do differently. And as we said in some of our earlier webinars, the impact of stress on creativity is real. And so the need for planning and to be more creative and not just adapt and kind of rejigger the plan that we had before does take a different degree of energy, and it does take intentional effort. And so we recognize that, but we think that there's great opportunity that comes as a result of it. If we go back to anything, that data drives planning, and that data is the external pieces that Meitler talked about, you know, some of the demographic and trend analysis, but it is also your own data. So if that whole piece of tracking and measuring what's working and what has worked really gives you the leverage and the validation to trust your instincts for the plans that you're going to take and build that plan to be fluid. You know, if nothing else, you know, it's going to be the backup, the what if to the what if to the what if, but you got to trust and take that first step to reduce that ambiguity, and then leverage your leadership. And it's your leadership in your own personal leadership, but it's also leveraging the leadership that you have within the institution. This is the time when, as we've talked about in our executive chat series, leaders really rise in crisis. And so you may have somebody that was a board member that maybe was a little quieter, may not have done something, but they may be the right voice right now to help you in this. So really make sure you're tapping into the leadership that you have access to, manage up where you need to relative to board leadership, and also utilize and engage your team. But be bold in what you're going to do, because there is good work that can be done. And we know that we're seeing that, and we're excited for what it can do for you. Angela, I'm so pleased that you could be with me. What do you want to share as we kind of come up to the close of the hour?
I love this final slide. I love this bold piece of it. There's an excitement and energy. Again, if there's ever been a time to just branch out from the ordinary and be innovative and be bold, now is that time. We're kind of in a world right now where certain ideas now that may have felt a little off kilter previously, we're now looking at and going, yes, that's fantastic. That's exactly what we need. So biggest thing is it's use that data to back up, you know, document your ideas. And I think that huge successes will come from that.
Absolutely. So this has been great. And I want to thank everybody who joined us for this fourth in our series. I think we've got, and let's see if we've got any outstanding questions. I don't think we do at this point, but I just want to thank you. And I want to thank you, Angela, for joining. This has been a great conversation. As always, we'll follow this up with the deck for your review, as well as a copy of the video so that you can revisit that. So again, we wish you every success going forward, and thank you for joining us. Angela, it's been great to be with you. Take care.
Hey, Melpo. Thank you.
All right. Bye to everybody.
Bye.